Well, again, normally Tony's on with us at 6:35 on Tuesdays, and we've been doing that for closing in on a year. We appreciate it, him coming on every week. And every once in a while, we move it to 7 when he's got a lot of different and extra things to talk about. And I was thinking about this coming in today, so I was talking to you off the air about this. I figured like today you would want like 90 seconds, and then you'd want to go because tomorrow's tax day, man.
Well, yeah, and let me tell you, I hope, and good morning to everybody. I'm proud to be among you. I hope we never have another 90 days delay for at least as long as I'm on this side of the ground. Let me tell you.
Let me ask you this before you jump into what you want to jump into. What is the major change, or what's the major hurdle for someone like you who does, a lot of this stuff, or folks in your business, when you did an extension or an extension like this happens? I know it's really never happened. I don't think it's happened before, at least not in my lifetime. But what's the hurdle? What's the biggest problem for you guys?
Well, it's sort of like if you move something down, then everything beyond it gets compressed more quickly to the part that you're doing. So it's sort of like we start to get into the year end in September. We start to look at things. So it's like July and a couple of extensions, and we're already thinking about next year. So there's really no, break and sort of clear your heart, clear your mind. We're going to have to do that very quickly. And another thing is we might be looking at stimulus number 4 coming in August. So, hang on to your hats. The whole world can change once again.
I know they're talking about similar to the last one, maybe another 6. I don't want to get. We'll get into it when it comes. All right, you want to talk a little bit about lawmakers, race, and all that. So I'm just going to wind up and let you go.
Thank you for giving me, the opportunity. And as I've always said, that I'm here to do the green, and I'm not here to do, the red or the blue. But this is really a subject of the green and black and white. And, few things will get me angry to the point of where I'm about to explode. And I know watching what we do every night and running what we run into, we're all pretty angry with what we see for varying reasons. But on July 8th, we've been talking about the whole, Ned Lamont thing and how he's been running the state under martial law and executive order, and why this legislature won't call him to task and won't start, challenging him on a lot of the self-dealing and a lot of the things. I mean, we counted, 17 things that he's done, 17 lies, and the list keeps getting longer. But we found something that would bring the legislature back into session. On July 8th, the Hartford Courant reported that police accountability, increasing access to the Internet, voting rights, and long-running issues of racial equality has everybody going back to the Capitol saying, this is job one. Now, none of that is bad stuff. Please don't misunderstand me. But the fact of the matter really is that we're not going to solve these issues by doing that, because historically we never have. I hate to tell people who are either well-meaning or whatever their meanings are that this stuff just doesn't work. And we're going to go back. I'm going to go way back. I'm going to go back more than 80 years, 1937. Aid to families with dependent children. These are attempts in society where, whatever you want to call it, behavioral modification legislation has been, shall we say, enacted with the idea of, legislating better behavior. Now, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children out of the Depression started under FDR. Now, what they really don't tell you in history is that FDR was a horrible racist, and FDR had a motive. Eleanor, his wife, was entirely different. Eleanor and Frank Sinatra did more for racial relations in this country than anybody ever credits them for. But this was always a thing between Eleanor and Franklin, because Franklin was very concerned about the fact that if I start to turn, shall I say, quote unquote, friendly to, back then, the Negro people, that was the polite term, I will lose the South and I will lose the country. So, okay, we're going to do something, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children. In this legislation, there was known as what was called the man in the house rule. And the man in the house rule was, well, okay, if dad's in the house with mom and the kids, you do not get aid to families with dependent children. People have been running around for years saying, what is this there for? How did it happen? Well, guess what? It was FDR, the creeping socialist. And the FDR who did other things that were quite questionable. So, it was the kind of thing that, is this a good thing to have, quote unquote, to support needy families? Sure. But when we start to, throw the little thing in there about this is how we're all going to make things wonderful, we get into trouble. Going to move this up a few years, Lee Elci. 1953, there's a television show. It was called Amos and Andy. And it was a situation comedy with black actors. It started on radio. The actual characters in radio were white people who would do voices. But then when it came to television, there were black actors that were playing the roles. Now, I've seen some of the shows, and it's what it is that there are vaudeville, shall we say, acting or characters that were played, and they were modified for TV. And the show had a terrific rating. It had a great amount of pride in the black community. Everybody knew these were characters. And a lot of the characters in the show, the professionals, the doctors, the lawyers, with the exception of Mr. Calhoun, were respectable people. The crooks and the lasses were all white, which is actually kind of humorous of itself. But the NAACP, again, with a good motive, went to the sponsor and they said, you got to pull this show. It's just, this is making people look terrible. And the sponsor did that. Now, the people who were the most wounded by this were the actors and the performers. If you think, and another thing is that the Reverend Jesse Jackson, before, whatever happened to Jesse Jackson, but in 1983, and I have this on tape, he came out and said, and I quote, these were wonderful characters with great humor that had terrific talent that paved the way for others. They should be celebrated and not be forgotten. Alvin Childress, who played Amos, said the only real thing that happened here is I lost my right to be an actor because the actors themselves were tainted and they couldn't do any work. And the same thing, really, Gone with the Wind most recently, when that was going to be pulled from, I guess it was HBO Max. Yeah. The whole contribution of Hattie McDaniel, the first black actress ever to win an Oscar. Go back and look at her induction into getting her Oscar award. It will bring you to tears. It is absolutely unbelievable. But again, sticking to the point, sticking to the green, the whole idea is once we get into this thing of we're going to legislate what's happening in the hearts and minds of men and women, which you can't change anyway, you get into much bigger messes. Move this up a little bit farther. The Great Society, 1965, Civil Rights Bill, Project Head Start, school integration, all good things, but what was the motivation? Lyndon Baines Johnson, probably the biggest racist ever to be in the presidential office. I don't want to say some of the terms that he used when he was actually there talking about this, but his thought was, well, if you throw people a bone, they're not going to give us a problem, and we're going to give them this, and everything's going to be wonderful. Guess what? It wasn't. Every major city between 1965 and 1970, with the exception of New York City, interestingly enough, because John Lindsay, who was the mayor, did a very good job in dealing with that. Every major city just about burned down to the ground, much more very similar to what we have now. Throwing money at things and building things. Look at, New Haven. It was really, Tootsie Roll Tower, the Knights of Columbus, the Coliseum, the Civic Center, the 34 connector. That was all part of the Great Society. And, we're living in a world now where we realize that, throwing money doesn't necessarily solve anything to anything. But move this up a little bit further, more, when I was a young adult, the 1970s, we had something called affirmative action. And affirmative action was actually an executive order of John F. Kennedy. And affirmative action said that we want to give everybody an equal shot. We want to give them we're going to affirmatively say everybody has equal opportunity. This became twisted over time to say that we will take the candidate who is of color because the candidate is of color. And Supreme Court in 1978 in Bakke versus California Board of Regents said, you can't do that. Any racism is bad, even reverse racism. So I'd like to respectfully state to our legislature, before I say what actually went on this week in terms of spending, that, guys, this ain't going to do anything. Your ball.
Well, I want to start with the last thing you said, the affirmative action, and
right.
I want to morph that into hate crimes. I was having a conversation yesterday, get your opinion on this, and you had mentioned, well, all racism is bad racism, but the conversation I was having with someone from the newspaper made me feel as though there really is no racism against whites. In fact, there is no hate crime against whites, and we talked about that for a little bit. So, yeah, I mean, I think everybody has been affected one way, shape, or form about affirmative action, but I wanted to morph that into the hate crime situation because that's what we got going on all over the place right now. Is there racism against whites, Tony, in your mind? And if so, is it looked upon even remotely the same way?
Well, yeah, and honestly, truthfully, and this is where, we want to look at black and white and red and blue. It comes down to the green. There certainly is racism against whites. There's racism against every race, because if one stands in the way of somebody's agenda, yeah, Lee Elci, they hate your guts. Simple as that, and just as difficult.
Okay, so what do we do about any of this stuff? I mean,
but this is really kind of where I'm headed, and I have a whole litany of, quote unquote, while the legislature was functioning on this stuff, what kind of money was spent and where this week. We'll get to that. But what do? We have to look at what will make people, equal. I mean, all of a sudden now we want to go all the way back to 1960 and have the whole civil rights struggle all over again. But really the things that we need to do is politicians, quote unquote, of whatever stripe, media of whatever stripe, you got to focus on two things: education and economics. You have to give somebody the right to say, I can do this myself, and I will not be dependent upon government. Government should only be there to service these interests and to provide things, like the schools, like the benefits where needed. But when it starts to become its highest good and people try to get a hold of that, I mean, that's really sort of the capsule answer to a whole lot of stuff you have to do in between. That's that's really the point of all this. If our legislature is going to say, well, this is job one, well, let's look at what the governor did this week. I'm just going to give you a couple of things, which are actually, or what the government did, which is absolutely incredible. Fisher Scientific, $2 million since the pandemic started and the fiscal year completed. SEMA 4, $118,000. Now, we've got this thing with masks. We're going to look at this. There's two vendors, Jack Rubenstein and the Rossi Family Foundation. You think, what does this have to do with race? Well, it has a lot when your state is burning down, and you better get a right head about what we need to do and what we need to fix before we start to fix, things that you think are important, which would be fixed by definition if we got this part right. I've counted $16.5 million. And these are importers who are supposed to get us masks. I've looked at the bills of lading on the shipping chart. This is really a fantastic journey. I've learned a lot of things. They have produced a total or imported a total of 800 masks. And this is at a time when everybody's got a mask. Everybody, the dog, the frog, and the hog has a mask. So, and it goes on. So it's like, can we deal with what's important, and then the other things will be handled by definition? We educate people. We want to educate them. We want them to do something, to be something in life. We have to provide the opportunity for them to actually accomplish something. Let me just say this. GNP. The GNP in this country is $21.5 billion. That's, trillion dollars with a T. For a given year. Do you realize that people of color control a third of that in their spending? You never hear that from any of their leaders. What can we do with this massive amount of money to make life better for everyone? No, we don't get that. We get, well, let's tear down the Virgin Mary.
And you look at every one of the, let's say, areas that are hotspots and trouble and violence, and where folks are living in a lot of cases in squalor and not being able to work and have no chance, I guess, for self-improvement. They're all run by Democrats, every single one of them.
Right, every single one. And this is really the thing that, when we talk about our state, when we talk about our legislature, and, we're just this little blip on, the whole humanity of the United States of America. We spent, just to tell you what we spent in FEMA CARES Act spending, $70.5 million, since since the puck was dropped in March, $70.5 million that was spent. And you say, well, okay, well, we've got some issues we have to deal with, but we're going to close schools and we're going to shut down commerce, and we have no forward vision whatsoever. I will say this, and you talked about you getting looked at with six heads yesterday. Again, I'm Lawrence D'Angelo's broken record, the Boston Consulting Group. And I'm not a parent and I'm not a grandparent, but I'm saying this, schools need to open. Teachers, if you're sitting there saying, the school can't open, you will be legislated out of existence, because the plan of what really the master plan for education, go to the Boston Consulting Group and read it. It's all about a socialist-based, or you could say social or socialist-based, national plan of education. You remove schools, you remove communities, it's like, well, if you make school opening difficult like you do restaurant opening, well, guess what? It's too difficult. And where that also leads is another thing we've discussed, universal basic income. Just hand them money and they'll follow like lemmings and follow you wherever you want to go.
And that's happening. Tony D is our guest. We got him for a couple more minutes, Tony. I don't know where you wanted to wrap this up, but I see here where you had sent me something about the lawmakers setting a platform uprooting racial inequities, Black, Puerto Rican caucuses.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to get spiritual. Believe me, every maybe 5 minutes a week, I'll try to be a spiritual person or look at this at a non, shall we say, economic vein. But we're never, ever going to solve any issues in this particular world unless people understand that. It's not something that could be legislated. We've looked at history. History doesn't work. Far better than the Connecticut legislature has tried to do this, and look at what happened. And now Connecticut thinks it's going to solve the problem, as Connecticut thinks it always does, starting with the payroll tax, where you and I first talked. So it's like the only thing that I really can say is that it really has to be each one of us saying, no, we're not going to take this. We're not going to take this destruction. We're not going to take this legislative wrongheadedness. We're not going to take this, pay-to-play economy. 50%, I'll leave you with this, 50% of the Connecticut economy is small businesses.
Right.
50% of it.
Yeah.
Now, of course, it's sort of like, we have the large employers. We have... and the state of Connecticut, which is the largest employer, tells you something's wrong right there.
Right.
And we have small businesses. If this state or if this region really, they're deserting, New York City for everything that the city offers because of the fact that they can't provide, basic security and comfort for the people that are there, or they don't want to. If this state cannot make an environment where small business can grow and prosper and deal and actually, do things and become self-sustaining, I mean, there's no hope for us. A large employer is not going to come to Connecticut. Get over it. They haven't come yet. And we're doing nothing in our quote-unquote daily dealings that would make them come. These people aren't stupid, and it's just... and I get very concerned where it's just like, well, the solution is more money out of Washington. I will say this, California, the 8th largest economy in the world, the entire stock... eighth largest economy in the world. The entire stock market gain yesterday was went to negative because they decided to close. Should they close for safety? Well, personally, I think they need to take safety measures, but the only thing that really gets us to a place is an economy. Because if I've got a job, if I've got a home, if I've got responsibilities, I'm not going to be in the streets rioting. I have to show up the next day and do what's there. You and I can't go in the bar at 3 p.m. and cause a riot. We have to show up the next day and do what we need to do.
Another stimulus is coming, and we can leave everybody with the thought. Right now, we're about $26.5 trillion in debt. I think when this president took over, we were 20, I think. I have to think about that, but I have to go back and look.
I believe it was 20.
Yeah, and we're heading, north of that, and another stimulus will add 2, 3, 4 trillion maybe on top of that by the time it all settles in. I mean, I don't know. Our grandkids are going to be paying for this forever and ever and ever. But this whole thing just doesn't work unless we work, right? Unless we're back to work. America is it's not going to function.
Well, back to work and back to education, because if we don't have community-based education, even with all its flaws and everything else, I mean, we start to destroy communities, and then we become, little desperate lemmings, waiting for a UBI check. Yeah, this is serious. It really is.
Tony, thank you as always, brother. It's always a pleasure.
It's an honor, and have a great day, everyone.
You too, man. Hang in there. I know it's a busy time for you.
Thank you.
All right, buddy.